It is a singular and lugubrious task to recount the descent of a soul into the abyssal maw of madness. Yet the annals of Innsmouth demand such a chronicle, lest the memory of what was once human be utterly swallowed by the squamous shadows that haunt that salt-rimed and decaying port. Long before the world knew Zadok Allen as the shambling, whiskey-soaked derelict of the wharves, a pathetic creature of tatters and incoherent terrors, he was a youth of remarkable constitution, an unclouded vision. In those antediluvian days, before the Great War and the subsequent silence of the sea, Innsmouth still clung, however precariously, to the vestiges of New England industry, though the air already bore that peculiar malodorous taint which the locals identified as the scent of the sea, but which the sensitive nose recognized as the very effluvium of the tomb. Young Zadok was a scion of the old stock, a lad whose lineage stretched back to the founding fathers of the colony, and his eyes, then clear and devoid of the watery rheum of his later years, looked upon the world with a hope that seems, in retrospect, nothing short of blasphemous. He walked the cobblestones of Federal Street with a firm stride, oblivious for a time to the subtle ichthyic changes beginning to manifest in the countenances of his neighbours. The tragedy of Zadok Allen is not merely one of personal ruin, but a microcosmic reflection of the town's own necrotic transformation under the influence of the esoteric order of Dagon and the unholy pacts forged by the sinister Captain Obed Marsh. The narrative of his resistance begins in the year of our Lord, 1846, a period when the shadows first began to lengthen over the Manaxet River. Zadok, then a clerk of some promise, began to notice a series of disquieting irregularities in the town's social fabric. It started with the disappearances, not of the transient sailors or the unwanted derelicts, but of the stalwart men and women who dared to question the new religious fervour emanating from the converted Masonic hall. He saw his childhood companions, lads with whom he had once fished the clear waters of the upper river, begin to withdraw into a sullen, wide-eyed silence. They developed a peculiar gait, a shuffling, hopping motion that suggested an anatomical rebellion against the constraints of terrestrial locomotion. Zadok, possessed of a scholarly bent and a dangerous curiosity, began to document these occurrences in a series of leather-bound journals. He recorded the genealogy of the Marsh family with a precision that would later serve as a roadmap to his own undoing. He noted the arrival of strange gold-wrought ornaments, jewellery of a design so non-Euclidean and alien that the very sight of it induced a primal revulsion. These artifacts, he surmised, were not the product of any earthly goldsmith, for their surfaces were etched with motifs of undersea horrors and batrachian deities that defied the taxonomies of any known civilization. As the 1850s dawned, the Innsmouth look became more than a mere local eccentricity. It became a pervasive and suffocating reality. Zadok observed the thickening of necks, the recession of chins, and the development of those unblinking glassy stares that seemed to look through the physical world and into some lightless watery void. He attempted to warn the mainland, embarking on arduous journeys to Newburyport and Arkham to speak with men of authority. Yet he found himself met with a wall of derisive skepticism. To the sophisticated minds of the university towns, his reports were the hallucinations of a provincial youth overwhelmed by the gloom of a dying seaport. They could not or would not conceive of a horror so vast that it transcended the boundaries of human biology. Undeterred by the apathy of the world, Zadok organized a small clandestine circle of resistance. This group, comprised of the few remaining families who had not yet succumbed to the promises of the Deep Ones, met in the damp basements of crumbling warehouses. Among them were Barnabas Orne, a man of iron will, and young Martha Waite, whose family had long shunned the sea. Together, they sought to gather evidence of the blasphemies occurring at Devil Reef. They watched from the heights of the cliffs as the moon hung gibbous and bloated in the sky, witnessing the unhallowed processions of boats that rowed out to the reef to meet things that should not exist in a sane universe. The horror reached a crescendo on a night of oppressive heat and unnatural stillness. Zadok and his companions had planned to intercept a shipment of the strange gold, hoping to present it to the federal authorities as undeniable proof of the town's corruption. However, they had underestimated the reach of the order. As they lay in wait near the derelict wharves, the very water seemed to come alive with a phosphorescent glow. From the depths of the harbour emerged figures that were neither fish nor frog nor man, but a terrifying amalgamation of all three. These entities, the progenitors of the Innsmouth blight, moved with a silent, undulating grace that mocked the clumsy movements of the shore dwellers. One by one, Zadok's allies were taken. Barnabas Orne was dragged into the black water, his screams stifled by the salt spray, while Martha Waite was cornered by a group of townspeople whose faces had already begun to melt into the hideous masks of the Deep Ones. Zadok alone managed to escape, fleeing into the labyrinthine alleys of the town, his mind reeling from the sight of the squamous ridgebacks and the gill slits that pulsed with the rhythmic alien life. He sought refuge in the attic of his family home, barricading the door against the wet, slapping sounds that echoed from the street below. In the days that followed, Zadok became a ghost in his own town. He watched from behind shuttered windows as the last vestiges of human civilization were stripped away. The churches were shuttered, replaced by the monolithic rites of Dagon. The schools were closed, for the children being born in Innsmouth required a different sort of education, one that involved the secrets of the abyssal trenches and the cyclopean cities of the sea floor. Zadok continued to write, his hand trembling as he recorded the names of the lost, but he knew that his words were shouting into a hurricane. The mainland remained oblivious, protected by a veil of rationalism that would not allow for the intrusion of the eldritch. The psychological toll of his isolation began to manifest in a series of auditory hallucinations. He heard the voices of his lost friends calling to him from the waves, their tones distorted by the medium of water. They spoke of the wonders of Yahanthle, the city beneath the sea, and promised a life eternal in the cold embrace of the Great Ones. These voices were not merely sounds, they were psychic intrusions that clawed at the foundations of his sanity. He found that he could no longer sleep, for his dreams were haunted by visions of colossal, tentacled deities and the crushing pressure of the deep. The final shattering of his resolve occurred when he ventured out to the reef in a desperate final attempt to find Barnabas or Martha. What he saw there, beneath the shimmering surface of the water, was a sight that no human eye was meant to behold. He saw the great stone structures of the Deep Ones, rising like the spires of a drowned cathedral. He saw the things that his neighbours were becoming, the transition from the terrestrial to the aquatic, a process of biological devolution that was as fascinating as it was repulsive. He realized then that the resistance was futile, for the infection was not merely in the blood, but in the very soil and sea of Innsmouth. Returning to the shore, a broken and hollowed shell of a man, Zadok found himself standing before the door of a nameless tavern, one of the few places where the illicit trade in spirits still flourished. He had spent his life in sobriety, a man of principle and reason, but the voices in his head had become a cacophony that he could no longer endure. The memory of the gill slits, the unblinking eyes, and the rhythmic chanting of the order pulsed in his brain like a fever. He reached for the latch, his fingers trembling with a palsy that would never leave him. Inside the dim, salt-crusted room, he encountered a man whose face was a nightmare of scales and bulges, yet who offered him a bottle of cheap, burning rye with a gesture that was almost mocking. Zadok took the bottle, his eyes fixed on the distant churning waters of the harbour. As the first searing draught of the liquid fire slid down his throat, the voices began to recede, replaced by a merciful, numbing fog. The horrors of the reef, the loss of his friends, and the impending doom of his race were momentarily eclipsed by the chemical embrace of the alcohol. Thus began the long, slow decay of Zadok Allen. He traded his journals for more bottles, his memories for the blessed oblivion of the stupor. He became a fixture of the waterfront, a cautionary tale for the few outsiders who dared to visit the shunned town. He would sit for hours, staring at the sea with a mixture of longing and loathing, his mind a shattered mosaic of the truth he had once tried to tell. The hope that had once animated his youth was extinguished, replaced by a singular, desperate need to drown the echoes of the deep. The tragedy of the Zadok Allen Chronicles is the tragedy of a man who saw too much and lived too long. He was the last witness to the human soul of Innsmouth before it was subsumed by the ancient watery darkness. His descent into drunkenness was not a failure of character, but a final, desperate act of self-preservation. A way to build a wall of glass between himself and the nameless blasphemies that lurked just beneath the surface of the waves. When the traveller would later find him, a babbling wreck of a man, they would see only the ruin. They could never imagine the hero who had once stood against the tide, or the unbearable weight of the secrets that forced him to seek solace in the bottle. The town of Innsmouth continued its inexorable slide into the abyss, the houses rotting and the wharves collapsing into the mud, but Zadok remained, a living monument to the horror. He was the memory that the town tried to forget, the human voice that refused to be silenced, even as it was muffled by the roar of the surf and the burning sting of the rye. In the end, his story is a testament to the fragility of the human mind when confronted with the vast, indifferent reaches of the cosmos, where the things we fear are not merely monsters of the imagination, but the very ancestors of our blood, waiting patiently in the dark for the day when the stars are right and the sea gives up its dead. As the years stretched into decades, the physical environment of Innsmouth seemed to warp in sympathy with Zadok's own mental dissolution. The very geometry of the streets appeared to shift, the angles of the houses becoming more acute and unnatural, as if the town were being slowly pulled into a different dimension of existence. Zadok, in his more lucid moments, those brief agonizing intervals between bottles, would wander the ruins of his youth. He passed the house where Martha Waite had lived, now overgrown with a strange, translucent moss that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. He avoided the waterfront when the tide was low, for the exposed mud flats revealed tracks that were never made by any creature of the earth. His journals, those meticulous records of his early resistance, were lost to the damp and the rats, their pages turning to a pulpy mass of illegible ink. Yet the knowledge they contained remained etched into the folds of his grey matter, a permanent scar on his consciousness. He remembered the names of the elders of the Order, the Marshes, the Gilmans, the Elliots, and he knew the dark lineage that bound them to the things in the deep. He knew that the gold they traded was not merely a medium of exchange, but a tether, a way for the deep ones to pull the town closer to the reef with every transaction. The isolation of Innsmouth became absolute. The railway line was abandoned, the tracks reclaimed by the salt marsh, and the road to Arkham became a treacherous path through a landscape that seemed to actively repel the intruder. Zadok was the only bridge between the world of men and the world of the shadows, a bridge that was rapidly crumbling into the sea. He saw the federal agents who occasionally sniffed around the edges of the town, men in suits who looked upon the inhabitants with a mixture of disgust and confusion. He tried to speak to them, to grab their lapels and scream the truth into their faces, but his voice had become a raspy croak, and his breath reeked so strongly of decay and spirits that they pushed him aside as a common nuisance. There were nights when the moon was hidden by thick, oily clouds, and the sound of the drums would drift across the water from Devil Reef. On those nights, Zadok would huddle in the lee of a rotting warehouse, his hands clamped over his ears, but the rhythm was not merely auditory. It was a heartbeat, a pulse that resonated in his very bones. He knew that the great Cthulhu lay dreaming in his sunken city, and that the rites of Dagon were merely a prelude to a much larger and more terrible awakening. He felt the weight of the water above him, the crushing pressure of the miles of ocean that separated the surface from the true masters of the earth. His physical appearance began to mirror his internal state. His skin became sallow and parchment-like, his eyes perpetually bloodshot and bulging, not from the Innsmouth look, but from the sheer strain of his constant vigil. He was a man who had stared into the sun and seen only the black spots of the void. His clothes were a patchwork of rags, stiff with salt and grime, and he moved with a hesitant, shuffling gait that was a cruel parody of the hopping walk of the hybrids he so loathed. He was a spectre of the past, a ghost haunting the ruins of a civilization that had been betrayed by its own greed and curiosity. The few remaining humans in the town, those who had not yet been taken or converted, looked upon Zadok with a strange sort of reverence, as if he were a holy man of a forgotten faith. They brought him scraps of food and the occasional bottle of bootleg liquor, not out of charity, but out of a superstitious fear. They believed that as long as Zadok remained, the final transition would be delayed, that he was a lightning rod for the wrath of the sea, absorbing the horror so that they might have a few more days of sunlight. But Zadok knew that the end was inevitable. He had seen the transformation in the eyes of the children, the way they looked at the water with a hunger that no earthly food could satisfy. He had seen the way the elders of the Marsh family had begun to retreat into the sea, their bodies becoming more streamlined and their movements more fluid, until they finally vanished beneath the waves, never to return to the shore. He knew that the pact made by Obed Marsh was a debt that could never be fully paid, a mortgage on the very soul of the town that was now being foreclosed. In his final years, before the arrival of the narrator who would finally record his testimony, Zadok's mind became a swirling vortex of memory and hallucination. He saw the faces of Barnabas and Martha in the foam of the breakers, their features twisted into expressions of eternal agony and ecstatic release. He heard the chanting of the Pnakotic manuscripts in the wind that howled through the empty belfries of the churches. He realized that the resistance he had attempted as a young man was not merely a failure of action, but a failure of understanding. One does not resist the tide. One either swims with it or is drowned by it. He chose to drown, but he chose to drown in the spirit rather than the sea. The alcohol was his ocean, a medium in which he could exist without the constant searing pain of awareness. It was a slow suicide, a decades-long erosion of the self that left only the most primal instincts of survival. Yet even in his deepest stupors, the core of his humanity remained, a small, flickering flame of defiance that refused to be extinguished. He was the man who said no to the deep, even if that no was whispered through a haze of whiskey and despair. The tragedy of Zadok Allen is a narrative of cosmic proportions, played out in the claustrophobic confines of a dying New England town. It is a story of the limits of human endurance and the terrifying reality of our place in a universe that is both ancient and hostile. When we look upon the figure of the old drunkard, we should not see a failure, but a survivor of a war that most of us do not even know is being waged. He was the sentry on the wall, the witness to the shadow, and his fall was the fall of Innsmouth itself. The shadows that over Innsmouth fell were not merely of the physical world. They were the shadows of an elder reality that predates the rise of man and will endure long after our cities have crumbled into dust. Zadok Allen, in his youth, tried to hold back those shadows with the flickering candle of his reason. When the candle went out, he did not surrender to the dark. He sought refuge in the fire of the bottle, a temporary and tragic light that served to obscure the horrors he could no longer bear to see. As the fog rolls in from the sea, thick and cloying with the scent of things that have no name, one can almost hear the echoes of Zadok's laughter, a dry, hacking sound that carries the weight of 1,000 years of sorrow. It is the laughter of a man who knows the punchline of the cosmic joke, the man who knows that beneath the beauty of the world lies a festering, squamous truth that no amount of prayer or progress can ever truly erase. He was Zadok Allen, the resistance of Innsmouth, and his story is written in the salt, the silt, and the bitter dregs of 1,000 empty bottles. The final chapters of his internal chronicle, never spoken but always felt, involve a profound realization of the cyclical nature of the horror. He understood that Innsmouth was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much larger malady. There were other ports, other forgotten villages, where the same pacts were being made and the same shadows were lengthening. The deep ones were patient, their lifespans measured in aeons, and they could afford to wait for the slow decay of human resolve. Zadok's resistance had been a momentary ripple in a vast, dark ocean, a brief disturbance that was quickly smoothed over by the relentless pressure of the deep. In the end, his life was a testament to the power of memory, as both a burden and a weapon. He remembered the town when it was whole, when the bells of the churches rang for the living and not for the drowned. He remembered the faces of the people before they became monsters, and in remembering he preserved a fragment of their humanity. His drunkenness was the price he paid for that memory. The tax levied by a cruel and indifferent universe on those who refuse to forget. As he sat on the crumbling stones of the wharf, watching the sunset cast long, distorted shadows across the harbour, Zadok Allen was the loneliest man on earth. He was a bridge to a past that no longer existed, and a witness to a future that was too terrible to contemplate. He was the guardian of a secret that was eating him alive, a secret that he would eventually pass on to a stranger, hoping that the burden would be shared, yet knowing that it would only lead to more madness and more shadows. The story of the young Zadok, the hopeful clerk who believed he could save his town, is a tragedy of the highest order. It is the story of the loss of innocence on a cosmic scale, where the monsters are not under the bed, but in the mirror and in the blood. It is a story that ends not with a bang, but with a whimper, the sound of a cork being pulled from a bottle, and the soft, rhythmic slapping of the waves against the shore, waiting for the next soul to be claimed by the shadow over Innsmouth. The atmosphere of the town in those final years of his life was one of stagnant expectation. The very air seemed to be waiting for a signal, a word from the depths that would trigger the final metamorphosis. Zadok could feel it in the vibrations of the ground and the strange, iridescent sheen on the surface of the Manuxet. He knew that his time was short, and that the alcohol was no longer enough to keep the visions at bay. The voices were louder now, more insistent, and they no longer spoke of wonders, but of the inevitable return of the old ones. He thought of the journals he had written as a young man, the pages filled with his youthful indignation and his desperate pleas for help. He realized that they were the only true record of what had happened, the only evidence that Innsmouth had once been a place of men and not of shadows. He hoped that somewhere, in some dusty archive or forgotten attic, a fragment of his writing might survive, a warning to future generations of the dangers that lurk in the dark corners of the world. But even that hope was tempered by the knowledge of the power of the Order. They were everywhere, their influence reaching into the highest levels of government and academia. They would see to it that the truth was suppressed, that the stories of Innsmouth were dismissed as the ravings of madmen and the fantasies of the superstitious. They would protect the secret until the day when it no longer needed to be a secret, when the world was ready to be reclaimed by its original masters. Zadok's final days were spent in a state of perpetual twilight, a blurred existence where the past and the present were indistinguishable. He saw the ghosts of his friends walking the streets of the town, their faces youthful and full of life, and he saw the monsters they had become, their bodies twisted and alien. He lived in a world of overlapping realities, a non-Euclidean landscape where the laws of physics and morality no longer applied. When the narrator finally arrived in Innsmouth, seeking the truth behind the rumours, he found a man who was more shadow than substance. Zadok's testimony, delivered in a series of disjointed, whiskey-fueled outbursts, was the final act of his resistance. He gave the stranger the key to the mystery, the map to the horror, and in doing so, he finally allowed himself to let go. He had done his duty, he had kept the watch, and now he could finally sink into the dark, quiet waters of the end. The tragedy of Zadok Allen is the tragedy of us all, for we are all living in the shadow of a vast and incomprehensible reality. We build our cities and our civilizations on the thin crust of the earth, oblivious to the horrors that lie beneath. We tell ourselves that we are the masters of our destiny, but we are merely tenants on a world that does not belong to us. Zadok Allen was the only one who saw the truth, and his reward was a life of madness and a death of obscurity. The sea continues to beat against the shores of Innsmouth, the waves relentless and eternal. The shadows continue to lengthen, and the things in the deep continue to wait. And somewhere in the dark, salt-rimed reaches of the memory, the voice of Zadok Allen can still be heard. A raspy, drunken whisper that speaks of the gold, the reef, and the nameless blasphemies that haunt the dreams of men. It is a voice that will never be silenced, for it is the voice of the truth, and the truth, like the sea, is deep and cold and full of monsters. In the final accounting, Zadok's life was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of absolute despair. He did not win his war, but he did not surrender his soul until the very end. He fought with the only weapons he had: his eyes, his memory, and finally his silence. His drunkenness was not a defeat, but a tactical retreat, a way to survive in a world that had become a nightmare. He was the last man of Innsmouth, and his story is the final, mournful cry of a species that has looked into the abyss and found that the abyss was looking back. The chronicles of his life, from the hopeful youth to the broken derelict, serve as a grim reminder of the price of knowledge. To know the truth is to be forever changed, to be alienated from the world of men and drawn into the world of the shadows. Zadok Allen paid that price willingly, and in doing so he became a hero of a different sort, a hero of the darkness, a sentinel of the secret, and a martyr to the truth that lies beneath the shadow over Innsmouth. As the narrator fled the town, the memory of Zadok's watery, terrified eyes stayed with him, a haunting reminder of the horror he had uncovered. He realized that Zadok was not just a character in a story, but a warning, a living embodiment of the fate that awaits all those who dare to peel back the veil of reality. The whiskey had not just been a way to forget, it had been a way to survive the unbearable weight of being the only one who knew the truth. And as the narrator himself began to feel the pull of the deep, the shadow of Zadok Allen loomed large, a tragic and prophetic figure standing on the edge of the world, watching the tide come in. The legacy of the Zadok Allen Chronicles is one of profound and unsettling dread. It challenges our assumptions about the world and our place in it, forcing us to confront the possibility that we are not alone, and that the things that share our world are far older and more powerful than we can imagine. It is a story that lingers in the mind like the smell of salt and decay, a story that reminds us that the shadows are always there, waiting for the light to fade. And in the center of those shadows stands Zadok Allen, the man who saw the truth and chose to drown it in a bottle of rye. The man who was the last best hope of a town that had already been lost to the deep. The final image of Zadok, sitting on the wharf as the sun dips below the horizon, is one of ultimate isolation. He is a man without a country, without a family, and without a future. He is a man who has been consumed by his own resistance, a man whose only solace is the burning liquid that allows him to briefly forget the horrors of the reef. He is the shadow over Innsmouth, the human face of a cosmic tragedy, and his story is the story of us all, if we only had the courage to see it. The dense, cloying atmosphere of the town, The rhythmic pulsing of the sea and the unblinking stares of the inhabitants all serve to create a sense of inevitable doom. The tragedy of Zadok Allen is not that he failed, but that he was doomed from the start. The forces he was fighting were not merely physical, but metaphysical, a part of the very fabric of the universe. His resistance was a heroic but futile gesture, a scream into the void that was answered only by the cold, indifferent roar of the waves. And so the chronicle ends as it began, with the sound of the sea and the smell of decay. The story of Zadok Allen is a circle, a loop of memory and madness that returns always to the same point, the moment when the first drink was taken and the first shadow fell. It is a story that will be told as long as there are men to listen, and as long as there are shadows over Innsmouth to haunt our dreams. The bottle is empty, the sun has set, and the deep is calling. Zadok Allen has finally found his peace, but for the rest of us, the horror is only just beginning.